What if I told you that the man who terrorized an entire restaurant staff with his cruelty would one day risk everything to save the waitress who defied him? And what if that same waitress discovered a secret so devastating it would shatter everything she believed about her past? This is the story of how one young woman's courage exposed a billionaire's darkest truth and changed both their lives forever. The Bluebell Diner squatted on the edge of Houston like a forgotten relic, its neon sign flickering against the Texas heat. Inside, the air hung thick with grease, desperation, and something else, fear. Not the kind that comes from burnt coffee or angry customers, but the bone-deep terror that arrives every Tuesday at exactly 2:47 p.m. That's when Richard Hale's black Mercedes would pull into the parking lot. Rita Gonzalez pressed her palm against her apron pocket, feeling the outline of her anxiety medication. 43 years old, 22 years waitressing, and she still couldn't stop her hands from shaking when that car door slammed shut. Behind the counter, Carlos Martinez abandoned his grill, retreating to the kitchen's far corner like a wounded animal seeking shelter. "He's here," whispered Tyler Brooks, the 17-year-old busboy whose college dreams hinged on this minimum-wage job. His voice cracked with the same fear that plagued grown adults twice his age. Richard Hale wasn't just wealthy. Wealth was common in Houston's oil circles. Richard was something far more dangerous. A man who'd learned that money could purchase not just luxury, but complete submission. At 52, his silver hair and tailored suits commanded attention, but his eyes held the cold calculation of someone who viewed other humans as expendable resources. The bell above the door chimed its funeral song. "Where's my usual table?" His voice cut through the diner's nervous silence like a blade through silk. Not a question, a command wrapped in the thin veneer of civility. Rita scurried forward, her 22 years of experience reduced to the trembling movements of a scolded child. "Right this way, Mr. Hale. Table 7, just how you like it." But Richard wasn't moving. His glacial stare swept the restaurant, cataloging every detail, every potential failure. The torn booth cushion that hadn't been replaced. The coffee stain on Tyler's shirt. The way Carlos's spatula trembled against the grill. "This floor is filthy," he announced, though the tiles gleamed from Tyler's morning mopping. "And that music," he gestured dismissively at the soft country station. "Turn it off. Now." The silence that followed was deafening. Customers at other tables shifted uncomfortably, some reaching for their wallets, planning hasty exits. This wasn't their first witnessing of Richard's reign of terror, but it never got easier to watch. Tyler lunged for the radio, his 17-year-old reflexes stumbling over themselves in their eagerness to comply. The music died with an electronic wheeze, leaving only the hum of the ancient air conditioner and the sound of Rita's labored breathing. "Your usual coffee, Mr. Hale?" Rita's voice barely rose above a whisper. "My usual everything." Richard slid into his booth like a king claiming his throne. "And this time, don't make me wait while you gossip with the kitchen staff about your pathetic personal lives." The cruelty wasn't accidental, it was surgical. Richard had studied each staff member's vulnerabilities like a general mapping enemy territory. Rita's divorce proceedings. Carlos's sick mother who needed expensive medication. Tyler's rejection from his first-choice college and the crushing debt of his backup option. He wielded their desperation like a weapon. "And clean this table properly," Richard continued, running his finger along the surface and examining it with theatrical disgust. "I shouldn't have to explain basic hygiene to adults." Rita grabbed a fresh rag, scrubbing the already clean surface with the frantic energy of someone drowning in humiliation. Tears pricked at her eyes, but she blinked them back. Crying in front of Richard Hale was like bleeding in shark-infested waters. From behind the counter, Carlos watched his colleague's degradation with the helpless rage of a man trapped by circumstance. His mother's medical bills were due next week. His wife was pregnant with their third child. He couldn't afford the luxury of dignity. "Faster," Richard commanded, though Rita was already scrubbing hard enough to wear through the laminate. "I don't have all day to watch incompetent people pretend to work." This was Richard's twisted ritual. Not content with mere service, he demanded complete psychological submission. Every visit was a masterclass in systematic humiliation, designed to remind his victims exactly where they stood in his carefully constructed hierarchy of power. Tyler returned with a steaming coffee pot, his hands shaking so violently that liquid sloshed onto the saucer. Richard's eyes fixed on the spilled coffee like a predator spotting wounded prey. "Are you deliberately trying to ruin my afternoon?" Richard's voice dropped to the dangerous whisper that preceded his worst verbal assaults. "Or is this the best I can expect from someone too stupid to get into a real college?" The words hit Tyler like physical blows. His face crumpled with the particular devastation of youth confronting its own powerlessness. But he couldn't defend himself. His family needed this job. His future depended on swallowing every insult, absorbing every cruel word like a human punching bag. "I'm sorry, Mr. Hale," Tyler mumbled, dabbing at the spilled coffee with trembling fingers. "It won't happen again." "It better not." Richard leaned back, savoring the boy's humiliation like fine wine. "Because unlike your parents, I don't hand out participation trophies for failure." The attack on Tyler's family was the final straw for Carlos, who stepped forward despite every instinct screaming at him to stay hidden. His weathered hands clenched into fists, decades of construction work before the diner having built muscles that could easily overpower the soft billionaire. But Richard's smile only widened. He'd been waiting for this moment, the delicious instant when someone's dignity finally outweighed their desperation. "Something to say, Carlos?" Richard's tone was almost playful now. "Please, share your thoughts. I'm sure the owner would love to hear how his employees really feel about customer service." The threat hung in the air like poison gas. Everyone knew Richard played golf with the diner's owner every Sunday. One phone call, and Carlos would join Houston's growing ranks of unemployed men watching their families slide into poverty. Carlos's fists slowly unclenched. His shoulders sagged with the weight of defeat. "No, sir. Nothing to say." Richard's laughter was the sound of pure malevolence enjoying its victory. "I thought so." But as Richard basked in his cruel triumph, none of them could imagine that in just 24 hours, everything would change. A young woman from Dallas would walk through those doors carrying secrets that would expose the darkest truth of Richard's past. And the man who'd built his empire on breaking others would discover that some people simply refused to break. The storm was coming to the Bluebell Diner, and nothing would ever be the same again. Drop a comment below. Where are you watching this story unfold from? And if you want to see what happens when an unstoppable force meets an immovable object, hit that subscribe button. Because tomorrow, everything you think you know about power, family, and revenge is about to be turned upside down. Emma Collins pushed through the glass doors of the Bluebell Diner with the determined stride of someone who'd already survived too much to be intimidated by a greasy spoon restaurant. At 22, she carried herself with the particular confidence that comes from clawing your way up from rock bottom. Twice. Her story wasn't unique in Dallas. Community college graduate, 3 part-time jobs to pay for a studio apartment the size of a closet, ramen noodles for dinner 4 nights a week. But Emma had something most broke college kids didn't. Steel in her spine forged by years of foster homes and caseworkers who taught her that nobody was coming to save her. "You must be the new girl," Rita said, looking up from rolling silverware with the tired eyes of someone who'd given up on hope years ago. "I'm Rita. Been here since the Clinton administration, or at least it feels like it." Emma extended her hand with a genuine smile that seemed to physically brighten the dingy interior. "Emma Collins, thanks for giving me a shot on such short notice." Rita's handshake was limp, distracted. Her gaze kept drifting to the parking lot visible through the front windows, scanning for a particular black Mercedes that wouldn't arrive for hours, but already haunted her thoughts. "Training's pretty simple," Rita continued, leading Emma behind the counter. "Coffee goes in cups, food goes on plates, smile even when you want to scream. But there's one rule nobody wrote down in your employee handbook." Carlos emerged from the kitchen, wiping his hands on a grease-stained apron. His weathered face carried the exhaustion of a man fighting battles he couldn't win. "She talking about Tuesday?" he asked Rita. "Tuesday?" Emma looked between them, noting how both older employees seemed to shrink at the mention of the day. "Richard Hale," Tyler whispered, appearing with a bus tub full of dirty dishes. At 17, he already looked older than his years, worry lines etched prematurely around his eyes. "He's different from other customers." Rita shot Tyler a warning look. What Tyler means is Mr. Hale expects exceptional service. He's very particular about how things should be done. But Emma caught the subtext in their careful words, the way they exchanged glances like survivors of some shared trauma. She'd seen that look before, in group homes where certain counselors ruled through fear, in jobs where managers wielded their power like weapons. Particular how? Emma pressed. Just, Rita's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. Just do whatever he asks. Don't argue. Don't question. Don't make eye contact unless he speaks to you directly. And whatever you do, don't think you can change anything. The warning hung in the air like smoke from a house fire. Toxic, inescapable, suffocating hope before it could take root. Emma's training shift passed uneventfully. She learned the coffee machine's quirks, memorized the limited menu, and mastered the ancient cash register that seemed held together by prayer and electrical tape. But throughout the day, she noticed things. The way Rita flinched at sudden noises, how Carlos never fully relaxed even during slow periods, the defeated slump in Tyler's shoulders that no teenager should carry. By closing time, Emma had formed her theory. Tomorrow, she'd meet the man who'd broken these good people's spirits. And unlike Rita, Carlos, and Tyler, Emma Collins had learned long ago that she'd rather be jobless than spineless. She had no idea she was about to walk into a war. Tuesday arrived with the oppressive weight of an execution day. The staff's nervous energy was infectious. Rita checked her watch every 30 seconds. Carlos burned 2 orders he'd made perfectly 1,000 times before, and Tyler dropped an entire tray of clean glasses. At 2:45 p.m., Emma was wiping down tables when the atmosphere shifted. It was subtle at first, like the pressure change before a tornado. Conversations died mid-sentence. Customers suddenly found urgent reasons to leave, and the very air seemed to thicken with dread. Then she saw him. Richard Hale strode through the door like a conquering general surveying newly captured territory. His expensive suit cut a sharp silhouette against the diner's shabby interior, and his eyes, cold, calculating, predatory, swept the room with the casual arrogance of a man who'd never been denied anything he wanted. Emma watched, fascinated and horrified, as her colleagues transformed into frightened children. Rita's hands shook as she reached for the coffee pot. Carlos retreated so far into the kitchen he was practically hiding in the walk-in freezer. Tyler busied himself cleaning tables that were already spotless. "My table," Richard announced, not bothering to identify himself. In his world, everyone already knew who mattered. Rita scurried forward like a kicked dog returning to its master. "Of course, Mr. Hale. Right this way." But Richard wasn't moving toward his usual booth. His attention had fixed on Emma with the intensity of a hawk spotting a field mouse. She was the new variable in his carefully controlled environment, and variables needed to be tested, categorized, and ultimately dominated. "You," he said, pointing at Emma with the casual dismissiveness reserved for furniture. "Coffee. Black. Don't make me wait like the last incompetent girl who worked here." The diner went silent. Every eye turned to Emma, waiting to witness another soul crushed under Richard's heel. Rita held her breath. Carlos peeked out from the kitchen like a soldier watching incoming artillery. Emma set down her cleaning rag, looked Richard straight in the eye, and smiled. "Sir, I'll bring your coffee when it's ready, just like I do for everyone else." The words hit the diner like a thunderclap. Jaws dropped. Rita's cleaning cloth fell from her nerveless fingers. Carlos stepped fully out of the kitchen, certain he was hallucinating. Richard's face cycled through confusion, disbelief, and something else, something that might have been respect if it weren't buried under decades of entitlement. "Excuse me." His voice was dangerously quiet, the calm before a Category 5 hurricane. "I said I'll bring your coffee when it's ready." Emma's tone remained perfectly pleasant, as if she were discussing the weather instead of declaring war on a man who could destroy her life with a phone call. "The pot's brewing fresh. Should be about 3 minutes." She had no idea what she'd just triggered. Subscribe before you miss the fallout that's about to tear this diner apart. The silence stretched until it became unbearable. Richard studied Emma like a scientist examining a particularly interesting specimen, his head tilted slightly, as if trying to solve an equation that didn't quite compute. Then he smiled, not with warmth, but with the cold satisfaction of a predator that had just spotted its next meal. "Feisty," he murmured, sliding into his booth without breaking eye contact. "We'll see how long you last here, sweetheart." The declaration of war was subtle but unmistakable. Over the following week, Richard Hale's visits to the Bluebell Diner increased from once to 3 times weekly, each encounter a carefully orchestrated test of Emma's resolve. He arrived at different times: breakfast rush, lunch lull, dinner crowd, studying Emma's responses like a general mapping enemy territory. Would she crack under pressure when the diner was packed? Would exhaustion make her vulnerable during the quiet afternoon hours? But Emma Collins wasn't like the previous waitresses who'd wilted under Richard's psychological warfare. She'd been forged in harder fires than his manufactured cruelty. "More coffee," Richard commanded during his Thursday morning visit, snapping his fingers like summoning a dog. "I'll be right with you," Emma replied without looking up from taking another customer's order. Mrs. Patterson was here first. The elderly woman at table 3 beamed at Emma's courtesy. Richard's jaw tightened with the particular fury of someone unaccustomed to waiting. Rita watched from behind the counter, her anxiety medication doing little to calm the panic attacks that now struck whenever Richard and Emma occupied the same space. She'd seen this movie before: ambitious young waitresses who thought they could tame the beast, only to find themselves unemployed and blacklisted from every decent restaurant in Houston. "She's going to get us all fired," Rita whispered to Carlos during a brief lull. "He'll call Mr. Winston, and we'll all be out on the street by Friday." Carlos's scarred hands kneaded bread dough with unnecessary force, working out the frustration he couldn't express verbally. 23 years he'd been cooking, 15 at the diner, and he'd never seen anyone stand up to Richard Hale. Part of him admired Emma's courage. A larger part feared the inevitable retaliation. "Maybe she knows something we don't," Tyler suggested with the optimism unique to 17-year-olds who hadn't yet learned that the world usually rewards cowardice over courage. But Tyler had his own reasons for hoping Emma would survive Richard's gauntlet. Since her arrival, the diner felt different, lighter somehow, as if her refusal to submit had given everyone else permission to breathe. And if Tyler was honest with himself, Emma's smile had become the best part of his workday. "Kids got it bad," Carlos murmured, noticing how Tyler's eyes followed Emma's every movement. "We all do," Rita replied, but she wasn't talking about romantic infatuation. They were all falling for the dangerous dream that things might actually change. Richard seemed to sense the shift in his kingdom's atmosphere. His psychological attacks grew more sophisticated, more personal. He'd researched Emma's background, a skill that came naturally to someone who'd built an empire by knowing his enemy's weaknesses. "Community college," he mused during Friday's confrontation, loud enough for the entire diner to hear. "Let me guess, couldn't afford a real education? Or maybe the grades weren't quite good enough for a university that matters?" Emma refilled his coffee cup with steady hands. "Community college taught me plenty, including how to recognize when someone's trying to make themselves feel bigger by making others feel smaller." The other customers pretended not to listen while hanging on every word. This wasn't just dinner theater, it was a gladiatorial match between 2 fundamentally different worldviews. Richard's laugh was sharp as broken glass. "Philosophy from a waitress. How refreshing." He leaned back, studying Emma with renewed interest. "Tell me, sweetheart, what's your grand plan? Work here until you're 40, then retire to a trailer park." "I plan to work here until I find something better," Emma replied calmly. "But I won't spend a single day hating myself for how I pay my bills." The words landed like a direct hit. Richard's composure cracked for just a moment, long enough for everyone to glimpse the hollow man beneath the expensive suit. Because Emma had unknowingly touched on Richard's deepest fear, that all his wealth, all his power, all his cruelty was just elaborate camouflage for a profoundly empty existence. Their battle wasn't just about coffee service or workplace respect. It was about 2 diametrically opposed philosophies colliding in the fluorescent-lit arena of a roadside diner. Emma represented something Richard had forgotten existed: genuine strength that didn't require breaking others to feel powerful. She was proving that dignity wasn't for sale, that respect had to be earned rather than purchased. And for the first time in decades, Richard Hale found himself genuinely intrigued by another human being. Late Friday night, as Emma finished closing duties, Rita pulled her aside with the desperate urgency of someone delivering a final warning. "There were others before you," Rita said quietly. "Young girls who thought they could handle Richard Hale. Good girls with dreams and backbones. What happened to them?" Emma asked, though she suspected she already knew. They disappeared. Not all at once. Richard's too smart for that. But suddenly they'd miss shifts, or their schedules would get cut, or they'd find better opportunities elsewhere. Rita's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. Opportunities that never quite worked out the way they expected. Emma absorbed this information without flinching. She'd expected as much. Men like Richard didn't accumulate power by accepting defeat gracefully. Thanks for the warning, Emma said sincerely. But I'm not going anywhere. Rita studied the younger woman's face, searching for the false bravado that usually preceded spectacular falls. Instead, she found something that made her both hopeful and terrified. Emma Collins wasn't bluffing. She really wasn't afraid. What she overheard in that phone call would haunt her dreams and change everything she thought she knew about the man who'd become her enemy. But that conversation was still days away. For now, the battle lines were drawn, the armies were marshaled, and everyone was waiting to see which worldview would survive the coming war. The rainstorm hit Houston like divine judgment, turning the evening sky black as coal and transforming the diner's parking lot into a shallow lake. Emma had volunteered for the closing shift, partly for the extra hours, partly because the late-night quiet gave her space to think without Richard's psychological warfare echoing in her head. She was wiping down the last booth when she noticed the figure still sitting in the corner. Richard Hale, nursing his fourth cup of coffee and staring out at the storm with an expression she'd never seen before. Gone was the predatory arrogance, replaced by something raw and achingly human. Vulnerability. We're closed, Emma said quietly, more statement than demand. Richard didn't look up from his coffee. My driver went home hours ago. Figured I'd wait out the worst of it. It was a lie, and they both knew it. Richard Hale had enough money to hire a helicopter if he wanted to avoid getting wet. But for some reason, he didn't want to leave. More accurately, he didn't want to go home to the empty mansion that echoed with decades of his own cruelty. Emma should have left him there. Should have grabbed her keys and escaped before whatever was happening could complicate her already precarious situation. Instead, she found herself refilling his cup without being asked. You know, Richard said, his voice barely audible over the thunder. You remind me of someone. Emma waited, sensing that interrupting would shatter whatever spell was allowing this glimpse behind his armor. My wife. Ex-wife. Richard's laugh was bitter as black coffee. Back when we first met, she had your same steel. Couldn't be bought, couldn't be intimidated, couldn't be broken. Rain lashed against the windows with increasing fury, as if the storm outside was responding to the emotional tempest brewing inside the diner. What happened to her? Emma asked, though she suspected the answer would be painful. I did. The confession fell from Richard's lips like a stone into still water, sending ripples of truth through the carefully constructed lies he told himself. 23 years of marriage, and I spent every single day teaching her that her strength was inconvenient. Her opinions were unwelcome. Her dreams were less important than my comfort. Emma set down the coffee pot and really looked at him, not at the expensive suit or the cruel mouth that delivered daily humiliations, but at the man underneath. What she saw surprised her, genuine regret carved into his features like scars from old battles. She finally left 2 years ago, Richard continued, staring into his coffee as if it held answers to questions he was afraid to ask. Took hour? He stopped abruptly, swallowing words that seemed to cause physical pain. Took everything that mattered and disappeared. Can't say I blamed her. The silence stretched between them, filled only by rain drumming against glass and the distant rumble of thunder. Emma felt the strangest urge to comfort this broken man who'd spent weeks trying to break her. People can change, she said finally, surprised by her own words. Richard looked up then, meeting her eyes for the first time without calculation or cruelty. Just a man drowning in his own regrets, grasping for a lifeline he didn't deserve. Some people. His voice was so quiet she had to strain to hear it. But some of us have gone too far down the wrong road to find our way back. He stood then, leaving $100 bill on the table, more than the cost of 4 coffees. More than he'd ever tipped before, more than most of the staff made in tips during an entire shift. Thank you, he said simply, then walked into the storm without looking back. Emma stared at the money for a long time, her mind reeling from the encounter. This was the same man who'd reduced Tyler to tears over spilled coffee? The same monster who'd driven 3 previous waitresses to quit in shame? For the first time since their war began, Emma wondered if there might be more to Richard Hale than the cruel facade he showed the world. She thought she understood him now. She was dead wrong. The shift began subtly, so gradually that Emma almost missed it. Richard's visits continued with clockwork regularity, but the sharp edges of his cruelty had dulled, not disappeared. He was still demanding, still condescending, but the sadistic pleasure he'd once taken in others' pain seemed muted. Coffee, black, he ordered during Thursday's lunch rush, but without the finger-snapping theatrics that had once accompanied every request. Coming right up, Emma replied, noting how his eyes tracked her movements with something that wasn't quite calculation anymore. More like curiosity. Rita noticed the change too, though it filled her with anxiety rather than relief. He's planning something, she whispered to Carlos during a brief lull. Men like Richard Hale don't just get nicer. They get strategic. But Carlos had a different theory, born from 23 years of watching human nature play out across diner tables. Maybe he's just tired, he suggested. Tired of being the villain in everyone else's story. Tyler had his own observations, filtered through the lens of teenage romanticism and his growing fascination with Emma. He'd started timing his breaks to coincide with Richard's visits, ostensibly to bus tables, but really to study the increasingly complex dynamics between the waitress who'd captured his heart and the billionaire who seemed equally captivated. He watches her, Tyler confided to Carlos one afternoon. Not like before, not like he's planning to destroy her, like he's trying to figure out a puzzle. The puzzle deepened during late-night encounters when the diner emptied except for Emma and Richard. These weren't planned meetings, at least, Emma told herself they weren't. But somehow Richard always seemed to linger until closing time, and Emma always found reasons to stay busy near his table. You grew up in foster care, Richard said one Tuesday night. Not a question, but a statement delivered with surprising gentleness. Emma's hands stilled on the table she was wiping. How did you? Research. Richard's smile held no malice, just acknowledgement of his own invasive curiosity. I make it my business to understand people who interest me. Should I be flattered or terrified? Emma asked, but without the defensive edge that would have sharpened her voice weeks earlier. Depends. Richard leaned back, studying her with those calculating eyes that had learned to mask deeper emotions. What would you prefer? The question hung between them like a bridge neither was quite ready to cross. Emma felt the dangerous pull of whatever was building in these late-night conversations. Part intellectual sparring match, part confession booth, part something else entirely that she didn't want to name. I prefer honesty, she said finally. Dangerous preference. Richard's laugh held genuine warmth for perhaps the first time in years. Honesty has a way of changing everything. Carlos emerged from the kitchen, taking in the scene with the practiced eye of someone who'd witnessed countless human dramas unfold over coffee and pie. The body language between Emma and Richard had shifted, still tense, but with a different kind of tension. The electricity of conflict had transformed into something more complex, more perilous. Everything okay out here? Carlos asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. Just discussing philosophy, Richard replied without breaking eye contact with Emma. Miss Collins has some interesting perspectives on human nature. What happened next will shock you. Don't get caught unprepared for the revelation that changes everything. Emma felt heat rise in her cheeks, not embarrassment, but something more dangerous. The awareness that she was walking into emotional quicksand with her eyes wide open. I should finish closing, she said, though neither of them moved. You should, Richard agreed, making no effort to leave. The moment stretched until Tyler appeared from the back room, his teenage radar detecting the charged atmosphere with uncomfortable accuracy. His arrival shattered whatever spell had been weaving itself around the empty diner. I can finish up, Tyler offered, his voice carefully neutral despite the jealousy burning in his chest. Emma blinked, suddenly aware of how inappropriate the situation had become. She was fraternizing with the enemy. Worse, she was enjoying it. Thanks, Tyler. She grabbed her purse and keys with movements made clumsy by confusion. See you tomorrow, Mr. Hale. She was halfway to the door when Richard's voice stopped her. Emma. Not Miss Collins, Emma. Her name spoken with a familiarity that shouldn't have existed between them. Drive safe. The roads are dangerous at night. Something in his tone made her turn back, but Richard had already returned his attention to his coffee, dismissing her as effectively as if the moment had never happened. Emma left the diner with her mind spinning, unaware that Tyler was watching through the window as Richard pulled out his phone and made a call that would set devastating events in motion. "She's getting too close," Richard said into the phone, his voice carrying none of the warmth it had held moments before. "I need to know everything. Absolutely everything about Emma Collins' background, especially her adoption records." But the secret phone call she was about to overhear would destroy everything she thought she knew about her past, and the man who'd become far more than just her adversary. The phone call came at 1:17 a.m. on a Wednesday that started like any other, but would end with Emma's world shattered beyond recognition. She'd forgotten her textbook, Advanced Business Management, the one class she was taking to inch toward her bachelor's degree, and had driven back to the diner to retrieve it from the employee break room. The building should have been empty, dark, locked tight against the humid Houston night. Instead, she found Richard Hale's Mercedes in the parking lot and saw the faint glow of lights from the back booth. Emma's first instinct was to leave. Whatever Richard was doing here at this ungodly hour wasn't her business. But something about the scene felt wrong, not dangerous, but desperate. The same vulnerability she'd glimpsed during the rainstorm seemed to emanate from the building like heat from asphalt. She used her key as quietly as possible, slipping through the employee entrance and moving through the darkened kitchen toward the dining room. Richard's voice drifted toward her, low and urgent, filled with an emotion she'd never heard from him before. "Fear. I can't let her find out," Richard was saying, his phone pressed against his ear like a lifeline. "If she discovers the truth about the adoption, everything falls apart." Emma froze behind the kitchen door, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Adoption? Whose adoption?" "22 years I've been searching," Richard continued, his voice cracking with exhaustion and something that might have been grief. "Every lead, every private investigator, every dead end. And now she's here, working in my diner, and she has no idea who I am." The words hit Emma like physical blows. 22 years. Her age. Adoption records. The puzzle pieces swirled in her mind, refusing to form a coherent picture because the image they created was impossible. "No, you don't understand." Richard's voice rose slightly, taking on the edge of desperation. "I gave her up to protect her. My enemies, my business dealings. She was safer without me. But I never stopped looking. Never stopped hoping." Emma's legs felt like water. She gripped the doorframe to keep from collapsing as the full implications crashed over her. "Her name was Emily Grace," Richard whispered, and Emma's world tilted off its axis. Emily Grace Collins. Born March 15, 2002. Placed for adoption when she was 6 months old because her father was too much of a coward to protect her any other way. Emily Grace. The middle name on her birth certificate that nobody ever used. The name she'd only seen on official documents, always wondering why her adoptive parents had chosen Emma instead. "I know she goes by Emma now," Richard continued, unaware that his daughter was standing 20 feet away with tears streaming down her face. "But she's still my little girl. Still the baby I held for exactly 17 minutes before I let them take her away." Emma's knees buckled. She slid down the wall until she was sitting on the cold kitchen tile, her entire body shaking as 22 years of questions finally found their devastating answers. Richard Hale, the man who'd terrorized his employees, who'd made her life miserable for weeks, who'd somehow also shown her glimpses of unexpected humanity, was her father. The father who'd abandoned her. The father who'd let her grow up in foster homes while he built his empire of cruelty and wealth. "She looks exactly like her mother," Richard was saying now, his voice thick with unshed tears. "Same stubborn chin, same fire in her eyes. Same refusal to back down when she believes in something." Emma pressed her hands against her mouth to stifle the sob threatening to escape. Through her shock and heartbreak, she realized Richard was crying. Actually crying, as he spoke about the daughter he'd given away. "I watch her every day," he continued. "The way she treats people with kindness, the way she stands up for what's right. She's everything I used to be before the world taught me that money mattered more than morals. She's who I could have been if I'd been brave enough to choose love over power." The irony was devastating. Richard had been drawn to Emma not despite her strength, but because it reminded him of everything he'd lost when he gave her up. He'd been cruel to her because her goodness was a mirror reflecting his own moral bankruptcy. "No, I can't tell her," Richard said in response to something Emma couldn't hear. "How do you explain to someone that their father is the monster they've been fighting against? How do you say I gave you up because I was too selfish to change, but I want you back now that you've become everything I'm not?" Emma realized she was witnessing the complete destruction of a man who'd spent decades building walls around his heart, only to discover his daughter had been standing on the other side all along. "She's better off without me," Richard whispered, the words carrying the weight of absolute conviction. "She always has been. But God help me, I can't stay away, even if it destroys us both." The call ended with the soft click of disconnection, followed by silence so complete that Emma could hear her own heart breaking. She had two choices: confront the father who'd abandoned her, or run from the truth that changed everything she thought she knew about her life, her past, and the complex man who'd been both her greatest adversary and her biological parent. But as Emma sat in the darkness, surrounded by the smell of coffee and grease and shattered dreams, she realized there was no choice at all. Because tomorrow, she was going to demand answers from the man who'd given her life, and then thrown it away. The storm clouds had been building all morning, turning the Houston sky the color of old bruises. By afternoon, the first drops of rain began spattering against the diner's windows like tears from heaven itself. Emma had barely slept since overhearing Richard's devastating phone call. She'd spent the night staring at her ceiling, her mind cycling through 22 years of memories that now felt like lies. Every foster home, every caseworker's empty promise, every birthday spent wondering why her biological parents hadn't wanted her. All of it recontextualized by the knowledge that her father had been watching, searching, regretting. She arrived at work early, her hands shaking as she tied her apron. Rita took one look at her red-rimmed eyes and pale complexion and immediately began fussing. "Honey, you look terrible. Did you sleep at all?" "I'm fine," Emma lied, checking the clock. 2:30 p.m. In 17 minutes, her father, the words still felt alien in her mind, would walk through that door expecting another ordinary day of their twisted routine. But there would be nothing ordinary about today. "Maybe you should go home," Tyler suggested, his teenage concern genuine despite his obvious crush. "You've been working doubles all week." Emma shook her head, her jaw set with determination that had carried her through countless foster homes. "I need to be here." At exactly 2:47 p.m., Richard's Mercedes pulled into the parking lot. Emma watched through the window as he sat in the driver's seat for longer than usual, his hands gripping the steering wheel like a man preparing for battle. If only he knew how right that instinct was. The bell above the door chimed its familiar greeting, but today it sounded like a funeral dirge. Richard entered with his usual air of entitlement, but Emma caught the subtle signs of exhaustion in his posture, the slightly slumped shoulders, the lines around his eyes that spoke of a sleepless night. "My table," he announced, but his voice lacked its typical commanding edge. "Actually," Emma said, her voice carrying across the suddenly quiet diner, "I think we need to talk. Privately." Richard's head snapped up, meeting her eyes with surprise that quickly morphed into wariness. Around them, the other customers pretended not to listen while hanging on every word. Rita dropped her order pad. Carlos peered out from the kitchen like a man watching a car accident unfold. "I'm here for coffee," Richard said carefully, his businessman's instincts warning him that something had shifted in their dynamic. "And I'm here for answers." Emma untied her apron with deliberate slowness, never breaking eye contact. "About adoption records. About a little girl named Emily Grace. About 22 years of lies." The blood drained from Richard's face so quickly that for a moment Emma thought he might faint. His carefully constructed mask of arrogance crumbled, replaced by naked terror. "Emma. That's not my name, is it?" Her voice was steady as granite, but inside she was screaming. "Not the name you gave me, anyway. That would be Emily Grace Hale, wouldn't it?" The confession hung between them like a live wire. Every person in the diner held their breath, sensing they were witnessing something momentous and terrible. Richard looked around desperately, realizing their private tragedy was playing out on a very public stage. "Not here. Please. We can't. We can't and we will." Emma's foster care upbringing had taught her to fight for herself because nobody else would. Right here, right now, in front of everyone whose lives you've made miserable, tell them who you really are. Thunder rumbled overhead, and the first fat raindrops began pelting the windows with increasing intensity. The truth gets darker. Subscribe so you're never blindsided by what people hide behind their masks. You want the truth? Richard's voice broke, 22 years of suppressed emotion finally erupting. Fine. You're my daughter. My little girl who I held for 17 minutes before I let strangers take you away because I was too much of a coward to be the father you deserved. Gasps echoed through the diner. Rita pressed her hand to her heart. Carlos stepped fully into the dining room, his face etched with disbelief. Tyler's mouth fell open as he processed the impossible revelation. Coward. Emma's laugh was sharp as broken glass. Is that what you call abandoning a baby? Letting her grow up in foster homes while you built your empire of cruelty? You don't understand. Then explain it. Emma's composure finally cracked, years of pain pouring out in a torrent of words. Explain how you gave me away and then spent weeks torturing me without having the decency to tell me who you were. Explain how you watched me struggle and fight and refused to acknowledge that you were my father. Richard stood slowly, his expensive suit unable to armor him against his daughter's justified rage. I was protecting you. From what? From me. The words exploded from him with the force of a dam bursting. From my enemies, my business dealings, the violence that follows money like mine. I made you an orphan to keep you safe from the monster I'd become. Lightning illuminated the diner in stark white, followed immediately by thunder that seemed to shake the building's foundation. The storm outside was nothing compared to the emotional tempest destroying 2 lives in real time. Safe. Emma's voice dropped to a whisper more terrifying than her shouts. You call foster care safe? Bouncing between homes where some families saw me as a paycheck and others saw me as free labor? Aging out of the system at 18 with nothing but a high school diploma and a garbage bag full of donations. Each word hit Richard like a physical blow. He'd constructed elaborate justifications for his abandonment, convinced himself that giving her up was noble sacrifice. But faced with the reality of what his daughter had endured, his rationalizations crumbled to dust. I looked for you, he whispered. Every day for 22 years. I hired investigators, followed every lead. But you never tried to take me back. Emma's voice was steady now, cold as winter steel. Even when you found me, you chose to keep playing games instead of telling me the truth. Because I knew this would happen. Richard gestured helplessly between them. I knew you'd hate me. And you should. I'm everything you despise. Cruel, selfish, weak when it mattered most. The diner had become a theater of the absurd. Witnesses to a family reunion that looked more like a gladiatorial match. Outside, the storm reached its crescendo, rain hammering against the windows like nature itself was weeping for their tragedy. But someone else had been listening to every word, and they had plans that would make this family drama seem like a gentle disagreement. Marcus Volkov smiled from his car in the parking lot, his phone recording every second of the revelation that would finally give him the leverage he needed to destroy Richard Hale completely. The recording lasted exactly 4 minutes and 37 seconds. 4 minutes and 37 seconds of Richard Hale confessing to abandoning his daughter, of Emma Collins revealing her true identity, of a family secret that Marcus Volkov could weaponize in a dozen different ways. Marcus had been Richard's business rival for 15 years, a shark in the oil industry who'd watched Richard's empire grow while his own stagnated. He'd tried hostile takeovers, corporate espionage, even blackmail, but Richard had always been too careful, too protected. Until now. Now Marcus had something better than financial leverage. He had emotional ammunition that would destroy Richard Hale from the inside out. Inside the diner, the confrontation had reached its devastating climax. Emma stood facing her father across a chasm of pain and betrayal that seemed impossible to bridge. The other customers had either fled or pressed themselves against the walls, unwilling witnesses to a family's destruction. I need time, Emma said finally, her voice hollow with exhaustion. I can't process this here. Now, with everyone watching. Richard nodded, understanding that he'd lost any right to make demands. Of course, whatever you need. What I need is 22 years of my life back. Emma grabbed her purse with shaking hands. What I need is parents who chose me over their own convenience. What I need is a father who loved me enough to fight for me instead of throwing me away. She was halfway to the door when Richard's broken voice stopped her. I did love you. I do love you. That's why I let you go. Emma turned back, tears streaming down her face. Love doesn't abandon people. Love fights. Love sacrifices. Love doesn't give up the moment things get difficult. She left then, walking into the storm without looking back. Richard remained frozen in the empty diner, surrounded by overturned chairs and shattered dreams. Marcus Volkov started his engine and followed Emma's car. The next morning brought consequences neither Richard nor Emma could have anticipated. Marcus's plan was elegant in its simplicity. He would use Emma as leverage against her father while simultaneously destroying them both. Emma had called in sick to work, unable to face the scene of yesterday's emotional carnage. She was nursing her third cup of coffee in her tiny apartment when the knock came. Miss Collins. The man at her door looked expensive. Italian suit, gold watch, predator's smile. My name is Marcus Volkov. I believe we have something to discuss regarding your father. Emma's blood turned to ice. I don't know what you're talking about. Marcus held up his phone, and Emma's own voice echoed from the speaker. That would be Emily Grace Hale, wouldn't it? May I come in? Marcus asked, though he was already stepping through her doorway. We have so much to discuss. An hour later, Emma understood the depths of the world her father had tried to protect her from. Marcus painted a picture of Richard's business dealings that went far beyond corporate ruthlessness, money laundering, illegal oil contracts, connections to dangerous people who resolved disputes with violence. Your father has made many enemies, Marcus explained, settling into her shabby couch like a king claiming a throne. People who would love nothing more than to hurt him through the daughter he abandoned. The daughter whose existence was a secret until yesterday. What do you want? Emma asked, though she dreaded the answer. Simple. You're going to help me destroy Richard Hale's empire. In exchange, I'll make sure no harm comes to you or your co-workers at the diner. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Marcus had done his homework. He knew about Rita's sick mother, Carlos's pregnant wife, Tyler's college dreams that depended on his job. And if I refuse? Marcus's smile was all teeth and no warmth. Then I released this recording to every news outlet in Texas. Billionaire oil baron abandons daughter to foster care while building fortune. Your private tragedy becomes public entertainment, and everyone you care about gets caught in the crossfire. Emma realized with dawning horror that her confrontation with Richard had put innocent people in danger. By demanding the truth, she'd exposed her found family at the diner to threats they couldn't even comprehend. Back at the Bluebell Diner, Richard was discovering that secrets, once revealed, have a way of attracting predators. Mr. Hale, Rita approached his usual booth with unprecedented nervousness. There are some men outside asking questions about Emma. About yesterday. Richard's head snapped up, his businessman's paranoia flooding his system with adrenaline. What kind of men? The kind that don't look like customers, Carlos said grimly, joining them from the kitchen. They've been sitting in that black SUV for an hour, making phone calls and taking pictures. Through the window, Richard could see the vehicle Carlos was describing. Professional surveillance, the kind used by people who made problems disappear permanently. His worst nightmare was coming true. By allowing his daughter to work here, by engaging in their public battle of wills, he painted a target on the backs of everyone Emma cared about. Close the diner, Richard ordered, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to life and death decisions. Send everyone home. Now. But Mr. Hale, Rita began. Now. Richard's bellow silenced all objections. Get Tyler and get out. Don't come back until I tell you it's safe. As the staff scrambled to obey, Richard pulled out his phone and made a call that would change everything. Vincent. It's Richard. I need a security team at the Bluebell Diner immediately. Full protection detail. He paused, watching the SUV with predatory intensity. And Vincent, if anyone tries to hurt my daughter or the people she cares about, I want them to understand that I didn't become a billionaire by being merciful. The phone call that night would change everything forever, because Emma was about to learn that having a powerful father came with both protection and a price she might not be willing to pay. The call came at 2 a.m., jolting Emma from the first real sleep she'd managed in 48 hours. Emma. Richard's voice was strained. carrying an edge of desperation she'd never heard before. Are you safe? Are you at home? What? Emma sat up, instantly alert. What's going on? Marcus Volkov contacted you, didn't he? Richard's question was really a statement. I know his methods. Threats disguised as protection, leverage wrapped in concern. Emma's silence was answer enough. Listen to me carefully, Richard continued, his voice taking on the commanding tone that had built an empire. Whatever he promised you, whatever he threatened, none of it matters now. I'm sending a security team to your apartment. Don't let anyone in except. Stop. Emma's voice cut through his instructions like a blade. Just stop. I'm not a child you can protect with bodyguards and money. You don't understand the danger. I understand plenty. Emma stood, pacing her tiny apartment like a caged animal. I understand that Marcus Volkov has a recording of our conversation. I understand that he's threatening the people I work with. People who've shown me more kindness in 3 weeks than you did in 22 years. And I understand that this is all your fault. The accusation hung between them like a bridge neither wanted to cross. You're right, Richard said quietly. It is my fault. Every bit of it. I brought this danger into your life by being too selfish to stay away. Emma had expected him to argue, to deflect blame the way powerful men always did. His immediate acceptance of responsibility caught her off guard. Volkov wants me to help him destroy your business, she said, testing his reaction. Then do it. The words hit Emma like a physical blow. What? Help him? Richard's voice was steady, resolved. If that's what it takes to keep you and the others safe, burn it all down. I built that empire on the ashes of better men than me. Maybe it's time for it to join them. For the first time since learning the truth about her parentage, Emma heard something in Richard's voice that sounded like the man she'd glimpsed during those late-night conversations. The man who might have been her father if he'd chosen love over power all those years ago. You can't be serious, she said. Dead serious. Richard's laugh was bitter but genuine. Do you know what I realized yesterday? Watching you walk away, seeing the pain in your eyes that I put there, I realized that everything I built, every dollar, every deal, every moment of respect I commanded through fear, none of it matters if the one person whose opinion actually counts thinks I'm a monster. Emma sank into her threadbare armchair, overwhelmed by the complexity of emotions Richard's words stirred in her chest. Anger, yes, but also something that felt dangerously close to forgiveness. The staff at the diner, she said carefully. Rita, Carlos, Tyler, they're not part of your world. They shouldn't have to pay for your mistakes. They won't. The steel returned to Richard's voice, the tone of a man making promises he intended to keep. I've already arranged security. Full protection, around the clock, until this is over. And how exactly do you plan to end it? By giving Marcus what he's really after. Me. Most people never see betrayal coming. Subscribe to stay ahead of the twists that destroy everything. The next morning brought a surreal normalcy to the Bluebell Diner that felt like the calm before a hurricane. Richard had been true to his word. Security teams in unmarked cars watched the building, and the black SUV that had terrorized the staff had disappeared. But the most shocking change was in Richard himself. Good morning, Rita, he said as he entered, his voice carrying a warmth that made the veteran waitress drop her order pad. How's your mother feeling? Rita stared at him as if he'd grown a second head. She's better. Thank you for asking. Good to hear. Richard nodded to Carlos, who was watching the interaction with barely concealed amazement. Carlos, that breakfast special yesterday was excellent. You have real talent. The cook's weathered face creased into the first genuine smile he'd shown at work in years. Thank you, Mr. Hale. When Tyler approached with coffee, Richard stood and extended his hand for a formal handshake. Tyler, isn't it? I owe you an apology. Several apologies, actually. The way I've treated you, all of you, was inexcusable. Tyler stared at the offered hand as if it might contain a snake. Slowly, cautiously, he reached out and shook it. I also heard you're interested in business school, Richard continued. If you'd like, I could make some calls. Get you interviews at programs that might be more affordable than your current options. The teenager's eyes widened. You would do that? For me? For all of you? Richard looked around the diner, really looked, perhaps for the first time since he'd started coming here. This place, these people, you've been more of a family to my daughter in 3 weeks than I was to her in her entire life. You deserve better than the man I've been. Emma watched this transformation from the kitchen doorway, her emotions warring between skepticism and hope. Was this genuine change, or another manipulation? Was Richard Hale capable of becoming the father she needed, or was this performance just another business strategy? You don't trust it, Carlos observed quietly, joining her in the doorway. Would you? Emma asked. Carlos was quiet for a long moment, watching as Richard helped Rita clear tables, a task that would have been beneath him just days before. My father was a hard man, Carlos said finally. Worked construction, drank too much, had a temper that could shake the house. But when my mother got sick, when we needed him to be different, he found a way to change. Not overnight, not easily, but genuinely. What's your point? Sometimes it takes losing everything to find out what actually matters. Carlos nodded toward Richard, who was now listening intently as Tyler explained his college plans. Maybe your father's finally figured out what he should have known 22 years ago. But even as Emma watched Richard's apparent transformation, she couldn't shake the feeling that Marcus Volkov was still out there, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And when he did, all the security teams and heartfelt apologies in the world might not be enough to protect the people who'd become her chosen family. The biggest shock was still waiting in the shadows, and it would test every bond they'd built, every trust they'd tentatively offered, every hope they'd dared to nurture in the space between forgiveness and justice. The attack came at dawn, when the diner was caught in that vulnerable hour between night shift cleanup and morning prep. Emma had arrived early, unable to sleep after another restless night of processing her father's transformation. She was brewing the first pot of coffee when she noticed the silence. No birds singing, no distant traffic hum. Even the ancient air conditioner had fallen quiet, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Through the kitchen window, she saw them, 6 men in dark clothing moving with military precision around the building's perimeter. Not Richard's security team. These men moved like predators, and their eyes held the cold professionalism of people comfortable with violence. Emma's blood turned to ice as the pieces fell into place. Marcus Volkov had grown tired of subtle manipulation. If he couldn't use her as leverage against Richard, he'd eliminate the problem entirely. Her phone buzzed with an incoming text from an unknown number. Say goodbye to your found family. You should have taken the deal. MV. Emma's hands shook as she dialed Richard's number, but the call went straight to voicemail. Then Carlos's phone. Rita's. Tyler's. All dead air. She was alone. The front door's bell chimed with deceptive normalcy as the first intruder entered. He was tall, scarred, with the casual confidence of a man who'd never met violence he couldn't handle. Emma Collins, he said, his accent carrying traces of Eastern Europe. You've caused considerable trouble for Mr. Volkov. Where are my friends? Emma's voice was steady despite the terror clawing at her chest. Safe. For now. The man smiled, but it held no warmth. Their continued health depends entirely on your cooperation. Emma backed toward the kitchen, her mind racing through limited options. The diner's landline was behind the counter, too far. The rear exit led to an alley that was probably already blocked. She was trapped with nowhere to run and no one coming to save her. But Emma Collins hadn't survived foster care and 22 years of fighting for herself by waiting for rescue. What kind of cooperation? She asked, buying time while her eyes cataloged potential weapons. Coffee pots. Kitchen knives. The baseball bat Carlos kept behind the register for late-night troublemakers. A simple video confession. You'll explain how your father abandoned you, destroyed your childhood, and deserves whatever justice Mr. Volkov provides. Very touching. Very believable. And then, the man's shrug was eloquent in its casual cruelty. Then you disappear, along with anyone who might corroborate inconvenient truths about tonight. Emma felt something cold and dangerous settle in her chest. The same ice-water calm that had carried her through her worst foster home, through aging out of the system, through every moment when she'd had to choose between surrender and survival. She chose survival. Okay, she said quietly. I'll make your video. The man relaxed slightly, confident in his control of the situation. It was the last mistake he'd ever make. Emma lunged for the coffee pot, swinging the hot ceramic container with all her strength. The scalding liquid caught the intruder full in the face, his screams of agony echoing through the empty diner. She didn't wait to see the damage. Emma vaulted over the counter, grabbing Carlos's baseball bat as boots thundered behind her. The front door burst open as more men poured in, but Emma was already moving toward the kitchen. "Take her alive," someone shouted in accented English. Emma laughed, actually laughed, as she overturned tables to block their path. These men had made a fundamental error. They'd threatened her family, and Emma Collins protected what was hers. The kitchen became a battleground. Emma used every dirty trick she'd learned on the streets, every survival instinct honed by years of hardship. She threw knives, swung the bat like a berserker, turned the familiar workspace into a maze of obstacles and improvised weapons. But she was outnumbered 5-1, and training eventually overcame desperation. Strong hands grabbed her arms, wrestling the bat away as she fought with the fury of a cornered animal. They zip-tied her wrists, ignoring her kicks and curses as they dragged her toward the dining room. Enough! The lead attacker's face was blistered and raw from the coffee burns, his professional composure replaced by personal hatred. "You want to fight? Let's see how brave you are when we start with the boy. Tyler." They had Tyler. Emma's resistance crumbled as they dragged him through the rear entrance, his face bloody, his 17-year-old eyes wide with terror that broke her heart. "Please," Emma whispered, all her fight draining away. "He's just a kid. He has nothing to do with this. He's leverage." The scarred man smiled, pleased to have found her breaking point. "And you're going to be a very cooperative little girl, or we'll discover just how much pain a teenager can endure." That's when the windows exploded. Richard Hale came through the front entrance like an avenging angel wrapped in Kevlar and carrying enough firepower to level a city block. Behind him came Vincent and a team of men who moved with the lethal precision of former Special Forces operators. "Get away from my daughter," Richard said quietly, his voice carrying more menace than 1,000 shouted threats. The battle that followed lasted less than 3 minutes, but felt like hours. Richard's security team moved with surgical efficiency, neutralizing threats with the kind of violence that came from protecting something precious. Emma watched her father. The word still felt foreign but increasingly right, as he personally ensured that anyone who'd threatened his daughter would never threaten anyone again. When the gunfire stopped, when the last of Volkov's men was either dead or zip-tied for police collection, Richard knelt beside his daughter with hands that shook despite his victory. "Are you hurt?" His eyes cataloged every visible injury with the desperate attention of a man who'd already lost her once. "I'm okay." Emma managed a weak smile. "But Tyler's fine. Rita and Carlos too. I had them moved to a safe house the moment I realized Volkov had stopped playing games." Richard helped her to her feet, his touch gentle, but his eyes still scanning for threats. "I'm sorry I was late. I had to deal with Volkov personally." Something in his tone made Emma study his face more carefully. "Deal with him how?" Richard's smile was cold as winter steel. "Marcus Volkov will never threaten anyone again. Ever." Victory came at a price no one expected. The complete destruction of the life Emma had built at the diner, the shattering of the small world where she'd found family among the fragments of other broken lives. But as she looked around at the aftermath of violence that had been necessary to protect the people she loved, Emma realized that sometimes the price of family was higher than anyone wanted to pay. And sometimes it was worth it anyway. 6 weeks after the attack that had turned the Bluebell Diner into a crime scene, Emma stood in the same location wearing a hard hat and surveying blueprints that would transform the space into something entirely new. "The kitchen expansion will triple your prep capacity," the contractor was saying, pointing to architectural drawings that bore little resemblance to the humble diner that had once stood here. "And the private dining room you requested will seat 20 comfortably." Emma nodded, but her attention was focused on the small details that mattered more than square footage. The memorial wall for Marcus Volkov's victims, the scholarship fund plaque for local kids like Tyler who needed help reaching their potential, the family photos that would replace the generic diner art. "Ms. Hale." The contractor's voice brought her back to the present. "Did you want to review the timeline again?" "Ms. Hale." Emma was still getting used to the name change. Not legally, not yet, but in the way people addressed her now that the truth of her parentage was public knowledge. The media had been relentless for the first 2 weeks, but Richard's PR team had managed the story with surgical precision, turning a tale of abandonment into one of redemption and family reunion. "The timeline's fine," Emma said. Just make sure the memorial wall is the first thing people see when they walk in. After the contractor left, Emma found herself alone in the gutted space, surrounded by the ghosts of conversations and confrontations that had changed her life forever. The booth where Richard had first shown his vulnerability. The kitchen where she'd overheard the truth about her adoption. The dining room where they'd faced each other across 22 years of pain and finally found their way to something that might eventually become forgiveness. Second thoughts. Richard's voice came from the doorway, and Emma turned to see her father. She could think of him that way now, most days, approaching with 2 coffee cups and the careful uncertainty that still characterized their relationship. About the renovation? No. Emma accepted the coffee, noting that he'd remembered exactly how she liked it prepared. About everything else? Daily. Richard nodded, understanding the complexity of rebuilding a relationship from the ashes of abandonment and betrayal. The therapist says that's normal. Trust takes time to rebuild, especially when it was never properly established in the first place. They were both seeing Dr. Marina Castillo, separately and together, working through the tangled psychology of their situation. Emma had been skeptical at first. Therapy seemed like a luxury she couldn't afford, but Richard's quiet insistence that healing required professional guidance had eventually won her over. Rita called this morning, Emma said, settling onto a construction sawhouse that served as makeshift seating. The insurance settlement came through for her mother's medical bills. Good. She deserves some peace of mind. Richard's voice carried none of the condescension that had once marked his every interaction with the diner staff. How's she adjusting to management training? Emma smiled, the first genuinely happy expression she'd worn in weeks. She cried for 10 minutes when I offered her the general manager position. Happy tears, but still. I think she's afraid it's all going to disappear. It won't. Richard's tone carried the absolute certainty of a man whose word had become his bond. I've transferred ownership of the property to you completely. Whatever happens between us, whatever our relationship becomes, this place and everyone who works here is protected. It was a gesture that meant more than any apology could have conveyed. By giving Emma complete control, Richard was acknowledging that her judgment, her values, her vision for their shared future mattered more than his money or influence. Tyler starts at Rice University in the fall. Emma continued, updating him on the extended family that had formed around their traumatic bonding experience. Full scholarship, thanks to your recommendation letters. That boy earned it himself. I just made sure the right people noticed his potential. They sat in comfortable silence, watching construction workers frame what would become the new kitchen. The space would be larger, more efficient, designed to handle the crowds that Emma hoped would come to experience what she was planning. Not just a restaurant, but a community gathering place where people like Rita, Carlos, and Tyler could build careers instead of just collecting paychecks. Carlos has been experimenting with fusion cuisine, Emma said, breaking the quiet. Tex-Mex meets comfort food. It's actually incredible. I'd like to try it sometime. If you wouldn't mind having dinner with your old man. The request was casual, but Emma heard the uncertainty underneath. 6 weeks of family therapy hadn't erased 22 years of absence, and Richard was still learning how to be a father to a grown daughter who'd raised herself. I'd like that, Emma said, surprised by how much she meant it. Maybe not here, though. Too many memories. There's a little Italian place near my office. Nothing fancy, just good food and quiet conversation. Emma nodded, then took a breath before addressing the question that had been haunting both their therapy sessions. Do you think we'll ever be normal? Like, actually father and daughter instead of 2 people trying to figure out how to forgive each other? Richard considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. I don't know, but I know that 6 weeks ago, you could barely stand to be in the same room with me. Today, we're planning a business together and talking about dinner. That feels like progress. Slow progress. The best kind, according to Dr. Castillo. Emma laughed, the sound echoing strangely in the empty space. She does love her incremental improvement theories. Speaking of improvement, Richard said carefully, I have something for you. Not a gift exactly. More like restitution. He pulled an envelope from his jacket pocket, thick with papers that looked official and important. Emma opened it to find documentation that made her coffee cup tremble in her hands. A trust fund. She looked up at him with confusion and a touch of anger. I told you I don't want your money. It's not my money. It's yours. Money I should have been setting aside for your education, your future, your security for the past 22 years. I can't give you back your childhood, but I can make sure you never have to worry about rent or tuition or any of the things that kept you up at night. Emma stared at the numbers on the bank statements, amounts that represented security she'd never dared imagine. But more than the money, she was struck by the careful documentation. College funds calculated from her birth, birthday savings that had accumulated interest for years, emergency accounts that proved he'd been thinking about her future even when he couldn't be part of it. If you're still not subscribing, comment why. What's stopping you from joining this journey? You really were looking for me, she said quietly. Every day, even when I told myself you were better off without me, I was still trying to find you, still hoping. Richard's voice carried the weight of 2 decades of regret. The money doesn't fix what I did, but maybe it can help build what we might become. Emma folded the papers carefully, her mind already spinning with possibilities. Not just for herself, but for the community center she wanted to build above the restaurant. For the scholarship fund that could help other foster kids like she'd been. For the kind of future that honored both the pain of her past and the hope of what lay ahead. Thank you, she said simply, because sometimes the most profound gratitude required the fewest words. They finished their coffee in silence, father and daughter sitting in the ruins of their old conflict while planning the foundation of something entirely new. Outside, Houston traffic hummed with the rhythm of a city in motion, but inside the shell of the Bluebell Diner, time seemed suspended between what was and what might be. Emma looked around one more time at the space where she'd learned that families could be chosen as well as born, where she'd discovered that forgiveness was possible even when it seemed impossible, where she'd found the father she'd never known she needed. In 3 months, the new Bluebell would open its doors to a community hungry for the kind of healing that only came from breaking bread together. There would be pictures on the walls of Rita's grandchildren, Carlos's wife and new baby, Tyler's college graduation. There would be a corner booth reserved for difficult conversations and second chances. And maybe, if they were very lucky and worked very hard at it, there would be a table where a father and daughter could share a meal without the ghosts of abandonment sitting between them. The legacy they were building wouldn't erase the past, but it might just prove that even the most broken families could learn to heal. 6 months later, the grand reopening of Bluebell Diner fell on a Tuesday, deliberately chosen to honor the day that had changed everything. Emma stood behind the gleaming new counter, watching as the first customers of the evening filled seats that had been carefully arranged to encourage conversation between strangers. The memorial wall drew visitors like a magnet. Photos of Marcus Volkov's victims, not just from the attack on the diner, but from 20 years of corporate violence, served as a reminder that some prices were too high to pay for power. Beneath each picture, a small plaque told their stories. The whistleblower who tried to expose illegal dumping, the journalist who'd investigated money laundering, the accountant who'd threatened to go to the FBI. They would have liked this, Rita said quietly, joining Emma at the counter. At 44, she wore her new title of general manager with pride that had transformed her posture and brightened her eyes. All those people who tried to do the right thing, they would have liked knowing their stories mattered. Emma nodded, her throat tight with emotion. The memorial had been her idea, but Richard had funded it without question, understanding that acknowledgement of past wrongs was necessary foundation for future healing. Table 12 wants to compliment the chef, Tyler called from the dining room. At 18, he'd grown 3 inches and gained the confidence that came from knowing his future was secure. Rice University would start in 2 months, but he'd spend summers working at Bluebell, learning business management from Emma and life skills from the family that had chosen him. Carlos emerged from the kitchen, his face flushed with pride and exertion. The new space had transformed him from a cook into a culinary artist, and his fusion menu had already attracted attention from food critics across Texas. Mrs. Patterson says the enchilada meatloaf reminds her of her grandmother's cooking, Tyler continued. She asked if we deliver to the senior center. We do now, Emma decided impulsively. Community outreach was always part of the plan. The evening rush brought familiar faces and new ones. Construction workers from nearby sites, families celebrating quiet milestones, couples on first dates who'd been drawn by the story of redemption that had made national news. Each table represented the community Emma had envisioned. Diverse, welcoming, built on the radical notion that everyone deserved good food and genuine care. At exactly 7:30 p.m., Richard arrived for their standing dinner appointment. 6 months of family therapy had taught them both that relationships required maintenance, that trust was rebuilt through small, consistent actions rather than grand gestures. "How's the new booth working out?" he asked, settling into the corner table Emma had designed specifically for private conversations. "3 marriage proposals this week," Emma replied with a grin. Apparently, the Second Chances booth has developed a reputation for meaningful conversations. Richard laughed, genuine warmth that still surprised Emma with its rarity and value. "Your mother would have loved that. She always believed in the power of honest communication." They'd been talking about Emma's mother more frequently as their relationship stabilized. Not with the pain that had once accompanied any mention of the woman Richard had driven away, but with the gentle melancholy of shared loss and the recognition that some wounds took decades to heal. "Tell me about the scholarship interviews," Richard said as Carlos brought their usual orders without being asked. 12 candidates this round. All foster kids aging out of the system. Emma's eyes lit up with the passion that had become her driving force. "There's this girl, Sophia, who reminds me so much of myself at 18. Scared but determined, broke but brilliant. And full ride to UT, plus housing allowance and a guaranteed internship at the diner during breaks." Emma's smile could have powered the restaurant's lighting. "She cried for 20 minutes when I told her." Richard nodded approvingly. The Emily Grace Foundation, named for the daughter he'd lost and found again, had become Emma's primary focus outside the restaurant. In 6 months, they provided scholarships to 8 young adults, job training to dozens more, and emergency assistance to families in crisis. "I have some news," Richard said carefully, setting down his coffee cup with the precise movements that indicated serious conversation. "The Justice Department wants to interview me about Volkov's business connections. Full cooperation, full immunity, complete transparency about the oil industries, more questionable practices." Emma studied her father's face, reading the mixture of relief and apprehension in his expression. "How do you feel about that?" "Terrified. Hopeful. Guilty as hell." Richard's laugh was rueful. "Mostly relieved that I'll finally be able to sleep without wondering what other monsters I helped create. It's the right thing to do. It's what you would do. That has to be enough." They finished dinner while discussing mundane topics: the restaurant's expansion plans, Tyler's college preparation, Rita's daughter's upcoming wedding. But underneath the ordinary conversation lay the extraordinary foundation they'd built. A relationship based on choice rather than obligation, on mutual respect rather than genetic accident. As the evening wound down and the last customers settled their tabs, Emma found herself standing once again in the space that had transformed her life. The new Bluebell bore little physical resemblance to the humble diner where she'd first confronted her father, but it carried the same essential spirit, a place where people could find nourishment for both body and soul. "Proud of what you've built here," Richard said quietly, joining her by the memorial wall. "We've built," Emma corrected. "This doesn't exist without your support, financial and otherwise. I wrote checks. You created the vision, did the work, made it matter." Emma looked around at the bustling restaurant, at Rita training a new server with patient kindness, at Carlos explaining his latest recipe to an interested customer, at Tyler bussing tables with the efficiency of someone who understood that every job mattered. If this story of redemption moved you, next week's will leave you speechless as we explore how love finds a way even in the darkest circumstances. "Do you think she would have been proud?" Emma asked suddenly. "My mother? Of what we've become?" Richard was quiet for a long moment, considering the question with the weight it deserved. "I think," he said finally, "she would have been amazed by the woman you became despite having me as a father. And I think she would have been hopeful about the man I'm trying to become because of having you as a daughter." It wasn't a perfect answer. Their relationship wasn't a perfect reconciliation. The Bluebell wasn't a perfect restaurant, and the community they'd built wasn't free from the complications that came with bringing broken people together and asking them to heal. But it was real. It was honest. It was built on the radical notion that people could change, that families could be chosen as well as inherited, and that sometimes the most beautiful things grew from the ashes of the most devastating fires. As Emma locked up the restaurant and said good night to her father, words that still felt miraculous in their ordinary simplicity, she thought about the 22 years they'd lost and the uncertain number of years they had ahead of them. Time was the one thing money couldn't buy back. But forgiveness, understanding, love built on foundation stronger than blood or obligation. Those were gifts that could be given freely, received gratefully, and shared abundantly. The Bluebell Diner stood as testament to the possibility of second chances, a beacon in a world that often felt too broken to heal. And every night, as the last lights dimmed and the staff headed home to their own complicated lives and chosen families, the building held the promise that tomorrow would bring new opportunities for connection, redemption, and the kind of love that transformed strangers into family. Some stories end with perfect resolution. Others end with perfect hope. Emma Collins, daughter, survivor, dreamer, fighter, had learned to prefer the latter.